The last two videos were a little too wholesome, so let's get aggressive again. First of all, you fanfiction authors have got to stop writing erotica. I started reading this fic and I closed it as soon as I realized it was about BDSM. Admittedly, I should have guessed from the chapter title hanging/wicking up restrained, but still, come on. This fic is probably also erotica, but the author is kind enough to give me a few paragraphs before anything graphic happens. It's called, oh boy, Touch of Destiny Part 1 The Fire Maiden by Ma-evelynn. Is it Ma-evelynn or Maevelynn? And like the piece from episode 4, the actual stuff happening is actually pretty interesting. You've got a girl reading in a library, and she's interrupted by some dude she likes, and he'll probably bone her silly before all this is over. It's a little cliche, but no worse than most other romance. There's a few problems I want to work on here. First of all, I like the fact that we're opening with a girl reading a book she's already read. It's pretty relatable, and it tells us a lot about her, that she really likes reading, and that she's probably bored. But this paragraph would be much more interesting and easier to read if we get more specific. What book is she reading? What chapter is she on? Interesting fact, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte uses the same opening of a girl reading, and Bronte does get specific. She tells us that Jane is reading about the history of British birds. That's much easier to picture than just the abstract concept of reading. The main problem, though, is that in this passage, the ratio of sentences to details is all wrong. Let me show you what I mean. This paragraph is actually one sentence trying to contain 5 details: the candles, the desk, the reading, the knock on the door, and the fact that she knows who it is. These are all excellent details for setting the scene and moving the story forward, but because they're clustered into one sentence like this, they speed along so fast that the reader can't process them. In general, you want to keep a ratio of one sentence to one detail. Let's take this passage one sentence at a time and separate out all the details. Sentence 1. The details are: 1. We have a girl, Maeve, who's reading a book that 2. She's read too many times before. We have 2.5 that she can probably recite it from memory, and 3 that she could do it with other books too, and 4 that she has a little library. Let's try to arrange these details in a more logical way. First, I want to move detail 4 closer to the beginning to help build the setting. Other than that, we'll keep the same details in the same order, but separate them into different sentences. In the corner of her little library, Maeve was reading a book. She had read it many times before. In fact, she could probably recite it from memory. The same could be said of every other book around her, from the old and dusty to the freshly bound. So I'm cheating a little bit here. Technically we have 2 details per sentence, but when I say sentence, I really mean sentence clause. Very roughly speaking, a clause is a complete thought that could be its own sentence. You can connect multiple clauses to make longer sentences, like this one, but each clause could in theory stand on its own. The skill of writing comes from artfully separating a scene into details, assigning one clause per detail, then reassembling those clauses into nicely formed sentences. This last clause is just a bit of flourish. I'm using the from X to Y structure to create a sense of scope, and improvising some details to help the reader picture the space. But other than that, I'm using the same words as the original, just arranged more artistically. Sentence 2. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this one. The sentence is just here to take up space, kind of an amateur attempt at pacing. It's good that the author recognizes the need to slow down, but a much better way to do it would be to use a more specific detail, maybe a brief look at what the book is about. Otherwise, you could delete this and lose nothing. Sentences 3 and 4. Similar to the last sentence, these sentences don't add much to the story. It's possible that the feeling mentioned will come back later, but if not, I'd like to see something more robust here. In fact, the reader should have a burning question at this point. Why is Maeve reading this book if she's read it already? We need to answer that question, or at least reassure the reader that an answer is coming. Sentence 5, the one we talked about in the introduction. Depending on how we change the previous paragraph, we can do different things here, but here's one option. Absorbed in her reading, she barely heard the knock on the door. For a moment she was startled, but even before she heard his voice, she knew instinctively who it was. So here, by splitting the sentence in 2, we slow things down and give the reader time to process the moment. I chose to split at the knock on the door for an important reason. The end of a sentence has emphasis. The last word of a sentence is what sticks in the reader's mind, so you should make it something important, like a knock at the door. As for these 2 details, I slipped them in so that the reader can see a little bit of Maeve's mind, and also to clue them in that the next line of dialogue belongs to Sinbad. Sentence 6. By now you should notice a pattern. This author uses long, awkward, trailing statements like this one to add details haphazardly instead of using normal sentences. You could rewrite the sentence like this to sound more natural, and I would also make this change to be less verbose. Now we sound much more professional. Sentence 7. We have the same problem again, a long trailing piece that should be its own sentence. This is technically called a parenthetical, and they can be useful if they're short, like this one. But long ones are confusing. It's a parenthetical, so it must not be important, but it's long, so it must be important. Huh? That's what your brain does when it reads the sentence. Turn long parentheticals like this into their own sentences. Here's my fully edited version. As you can see, each sentence is shorter. A period is a breath, so never make your reader go without one for long. And just as importantly, each sentence or clause has just one detail. That way, the reader has time to understand every image. We naturally have some questions at this point. Why are these characters awake? Why is Maevelynn reading this book? And of course, how long until the boning starts? And that's what I like about this piece, and why I chose it for review, because under the shoddy grammar, there's something genuinely intriguing happening. That being said, the grammar was still shoddy, and your reader won't get to the intrigue if they can't understand what you're saying, so make sure your sentences are organized and easy to read. That's all for today.